This meeting is being recorded.
So good afternoon, everybody, or good evening, wherever you happen to be today. Thanks for attending this session, the North American far right, battling across borders. My name is Bill Mullen. I'm one of the co-founders of the Campus Anti-Fascist Network, which is a co-sponsor of today's event. We're glad to have here a Transnational Institute panel held last month on the rise of authoritarian regimes globally. We're grateful to TNI for their sponsorship of today's session, as well as the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. And we also thank the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Verso Books for helping to promote today's event. We're going to focus today on the conditions which have created a new far-right resurgence across North America. As has been much reported in the press and debated on the left, the combination of ramped up capitalist inequality, Trumpism, and new waves of nationalism from both above at the state level and below at the street level. A new fluid, a far-right neo-Nazi. This phenomenon has been traced in the near term to events like the rise of the US Tea Party in 2009, but is also rooted in dynamics particular to North America: settler colonialism, slavery, anti-laborism, anti-communism, and legal authoritarianism. Our session will look at intersecting elements of this surge. Our speakers will, among others, take up these questions today. What role have racism, migration, and immigration played in motivating and jumpstarting far-right politics and mobilization? What forms of capitalist inequality and extraction have fueled the far right? And how have pro-natalist, pro-family, and transphobic politics given momentum to far-right organizing? And finally, the session will consider organizing strategies that have been or are in development in confronting the North American far-right forces. We have three great speakers today. They'll speak in the order in which I introduced them. Todd Gordon is an associate professor at Wilfrid Laurier University and an editor of Midnight Sun, where his article on the Canadian Freedom Convoy called Fascism as Canadian as the Maple Leaf appeared. He's co-author with Jeffrey Weber of Blood of Extraction, Canadian Imperialism in Latin America. Our second speaker will be Jeanelle Hope. Jeanelle is the director and associate professor of African American Studies at Prairie View A&M University. She's a native of Oakland, California, and a scholar of Black political thought, culture, and radical social movements. Her forthcoming co-authored book, The Black Antifascist Tradition, is under contract with Haymarket Books. You can read her work in Essence magazine on how African Americans have been at the vanguard of anti-fascist movements in the US. And then finally, Natasha Leonard is a columnist for The Intercept. She teaches critical journalism at the New School for Social Research in New York. She's the author of Being Numerous with Verso, Essays on Non-Fascist Life, and wrote an analysis of the intersection of white womanhood and fascism in a recent article for The Intercept on Giorgia Meloni's election in Italy. Our format today will be each speaker will talk for about 12 to 15 minutes, and I'll do my best to keep everybody in time. The session is optional, but we really encourage people to send questions for our panelists through the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. My colleague Ashley Dawson, who's helped to organize this event, and I will moderate and send forward questions to the speakers. Please be mindful in your use of the chat, if you do decide to use it, to make comments that advance and support the conversation. I will turn it over first to Todd then. Todd, go ahead.
Thanks, Bill. I hope people can hear me okay. And thanks to the TNI for organizing events, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and the opportunity to talk with folks about a really important and growing issue. And so any discussion of the contemporary far right in the Canadian context is going to pivot off of the so-called trucker or freedom convoy. I use freedom convoy. I think it's well, we'll get back into the question about the trucker aspect of it, but I use the term freedom convoy. But the first thing I just want to note, and it was alluded to by Bill, is that when you're discussing the far right and white supremacists reactionary politics in Canada, you have to note that Canada is, of course, a settler colonial society founded on that project of white supremacy, and its ongoing existence is premised or predicated on a militarized project of dispossession and the ongoing denial of sovereignty to Indigenous peoples. And so any discussion of the far right needs to be grounded in that longer arc of Canadian history, which obviously shapes its present. And that history is a fertile ground for reactionary racist politics and movements, of which the far right is one manifestation. It's not, of course, the only, but there is a long history of far right organizing in Canada, in which that politics has at different times leaked into the mainstream political landscape, typically via relations with mainstream conservative parties. So the Freedom Convoy, or so-called Freedom Convoy of the winter 2022, it doesn't step into some kind of untarnished Canadian history, but it's raised the contemporary profile of Canada's far right significantly and potentially reshaping Canada's political landscape in important ways. It was the biggest protest organized by the far right in Canada since the 1930s and has offered momentum and inspiration for far right forces in the country, both organized and in the sort of mainstream political landscape, I would argue. And so we can't predict the future, of course, but we shouldn't underestimate the opportunity for them to continue to grow and to become more radical, and possibly to pull the more mainstream conservative party to the right, which I think it already has actually, but and especially if the even further right People's Party continues to grow. And indeed, and I'll just wrap up, I'll come back to this point, but the newly elected leader of the Conservative Party was a supporter of the convoy movement, Pierre Poilievre, and has relations to people on the far right in the convoy. So just bracket that off for the moment. Even though many of the factors that inspired the growth of the far right elsewhere, including in the United States and Europe, were present in Canada, the resurgence of the far right in the Canadian context was delayed here relative to other parts of the world. And so, for example, the long-term impact of the war on terror and state-sanctioned Islamophobia, a rise in anti-immigrant sentiment and rhetoric, the emergence of, and at times, militant climate justice movement that inspired a conservative response, and the rise of a trans rights movement and other challenges to conventional notions of family and gender and masculinity. All these things have been a part of the political landscape of Canada over the last 2 decades or so, and would clearly play a role in the emergence of the Canadian far right. But one important difference that needs to be highlighted here between Canada on the one hand and the US and Europe, for example, on the other, is that Canadian capitalism wasn't hit nearly as hard by 2008, the 2008 global crisis, as its counterparts. The rhythms of Canadian capitalism, accumulation and crisis, here aren't an exact parallel as in other places. And so certain contradictions in Canadian capitalism clearly started to mount in the years after 2008, and then especially after 2014, when global oil and gas prices got really hit and dropped sharply. These have been building sharply over the last several years, and I'll come back to that. But in 2008 and its political after effects, they simply weren't as acute in Canada as they were elsewhere. So the resurgence of the far right had a slightly different pattern in Canada as it did in places like the United States or Europe or beyond there as well. The first window that did open for the contemporary far right in Canada was 2016, 2018, roughly. The economic crisis tendencies were deepening, and that was a part of it. But also very important at that point was the success of Donald Trump, his election campaign, obviously, and his ascendancy to the presidency, but also the success of far-right movements in the United States and in Europe, which clearly inspired far-right organizations in Canada, evidenced in the growth of organizations in Canada that either had ties or were shaped or influenced by the kinds of far-right organizations that emerged in the United States and in Europe in the decade or so preceding this. In the Canadian context, in this period, 2016 to 2018, there was also a spike in refugees, people originally seeking asylum in the United States, but who sought to enter Canada through non-official channels after Trump's election and then his so-called the Muslim ban. And this gave impetus to anti-immigrant groups who started raising the specter of illegal, quote unquote, illegals and queue jumpers crossing unofficial borders. And some polls started to show at that time an increase in concern about immigration in Canada. Around the same time in 2016, there was also the federal government passed a non-binding, and that's important, non-binding motion that condemned Islamophobia, but the far right, including a conservative newspaper, seized on that and kind of in a very conspiratorial way, argued that this motion would lead to Sharia law infiltrating the Canadian legal system. And so in this period, 2016 to 2018, you see beginnings of organizations like the Proud Boys, whose founder is a Canadian, Soldiers of Odin, I believe originally from Finland, ID Canada, influenced by Identity Europa, and Pegida start rallying and trying to organize a street-level presence in a number of cities across Canada. Initially in Toronto, interestingly, they were accompanied by groups you wouldn't necessarily usually see at far-right protests, like the Jewish Defense League in Toronto, And also in Toronto, there were some supporters, a sprinkling of supporters of the BJP, Narendra Modi, who were clearly drawn by the Islamophobia that was really salient in this early stage of the movement. But the iteration of 2016, 2018 wasn't particularly well organized or effective at propagandizing both beyond its kind of relatively small periphery. Outside of Quebec, where the organization La Mute had a membership of perhaps in the low thousands, its demonstrations never reached more than a few hundred, and it didn't have an electoral presence or an organized electoral presence. And so the window closed pretty quickly. And its last big event was the 2019 United We Roll campaign, which was a convoy from Alberta to Ottawa to protest what was claimed to be Justin Trudeau's anti-oil and gas policies, which is a gross overstatement. And so some of the key organizers of this United We Roll campaign in 2019 would be centrally involved in the Freedom Convoy. Nevertheless, Canadian capitalism remained fairly stagnant over this period in the years before the pandemic. Many of the contradictions were still mounting. Low corporate profits, very low growth, increasing business and particularly small business indebtedness, as well as household indebtedness, all of which would get worse through the pandemic. Particularly as pandemic mandates were introduced in Canada, restricting business activity, among other things. And so if the initial window of the far right from 2016 to 2018 in the Canadian context closed, the pandemic smashed it open. And to stress this point, though, it does go deeper than the pandemic. The pandemic smashes it open, but there's a lot more going on than simply the pandemic, even if the pandemic is pretty important in precipitating the current iteration of the far right. And it's not going to disappear and hasn't disappeared with COVID mandates. So anti-vaccine mandates, the protests start pretty early in the pandemic, pretty much as soon as mandates start. And they're across the country. From the very beginning, these protests, initially somewhat small, have far-right activists and open white supremacists and fascists who are well-known, playing a part and centrally involved. Almost all the key organizers and the social base that was central to the protests from the very beginning were small business owners, a social class that was very affected by the pre-COVID economic instability and which worsened for them with the pandemic-related shutdowns. The government had a pandemic loan program for business, but that just led to increasing indebtedness and for what many is clearly an unsustainable debt load, as is reported in all the sort of economic statistics and by small business organizations themselves. Canada actually has one of the highest rates of business indebtedness in the world now, in the advanced capitalist world, the global north, and the highest rate prior to COVID even of so-called zombie companies that only survive through loans and not through their own profits. By the summer of 2021, these demonstrations are becoming more frequent, larger, and more confrontational. And so in large cities like Toronto, not known for having a strong far right, there were thousands of people marching every week by the summer of 2021. But even in some smaller cities, demonstrations of several thousands were occurring. Hospitals and hospital workers, as well as government officials, were being targeted, in some cases physically. And so during the federal election campaign that summer 2021, anti-mandate protesters actively protested at pretty much every rally that the Prime Minister Justin Trudeau participated in. And in one of those rallies, an organizer of the far right, People's Party, was arrested for throwing stones at him. And it was the People's Party that actually in that election, which actually occurred in the fall of 2021, the People's Party gained more than any other party. Its vote share increased more than any other party, and it got 5% of the popular vote. And it's an openly far-right party. So the Freedom Convoy of the winter 2022 was the culmination of this movement. People traveled from across the country in the thousands to the capital, to Ottawa, and occupied it for nearly 3 weeks, the downtown. And prominently displayed were Nazi, Gadsden, Confederate, and red ensign flags. Supporters of the convoy began organizing large solidarity rallies in major cities across the country, and some started blockading a couple of border crossings, including the main border crossing for the North American supply chain that connects Windsor and Detroit, the Ambassador Bridge. And so nominally the movement was about restrictions on unvaccinated truck drivers crossing the Canadian-US border, but it was clearly about far more than that, because at the very beginning, the organizers drew up a demand for the dissolution of the government and for power to be given to them. And while it was billed as a trucker protest, most participants, in fact, weren't truckers. And even those who were truckers were the kind of people who could sit and not work for 3 weeks. These were owner operators and owners of small trucking businesses and so on. And in fact, most truckers who were wage workers, who work for someone else for a living in Ontario, that's mostly people from the South Asian community, were not participants in this at all. And in fact, studies show that most truck drivers in Canada were actually vaccinated, and the unions supporting truck drivers didn't support the convoy movement. And so most of the key organizers had small business background, or military, and were former intelligence officers. And so people who opposed the mandates and so on, but also really centrally involved in this protest in Ottawa and in all the cities and in the border blockades were farmers, and usually small farmers. And small farmers have been very vocally opposed to the mandates from the very beginning and complaining about quarantining rules that were required for people crossing borders, because small farmers in Canada, are big farmers too, use or rely heavily on temporary migrant labor or guest worker programs. It's the biggest source of farm labor in the country, people from Latin America and the Caribbean. And so what farmers were regularly doing was violating quarantine requirements and vaccine mandate protocols. And the farm sector was one of the worst sectors for outbreaks and deaths of workers as it related to COVID, often housed in extremely unsanitary conditions. It's a really, really terrible situation, but farmers were very active in this movement. And donors for the movement, because you could check the website for first at GoFundMe, that closed down, then Give, Send, Go, were largely, well, clearly there was a small business element to it as well. And major industry organizations, manufacturers groups, and so on, who rely heavily on the supply chain, were opposed, were openly opposed to the convoy movement. And so for their part, the Ottawa police, who counted convoy supporters among their members, did very little to stop the convoy, even as the convoy shut down large parts of the city core. They honked and blew horns all night, intimidated residents who didn't support them. It only ended when Justin Trudeau evoked the Emergencies Act, usually be called the War Measures Act, which is a significant overstep, I think, legally, but nevertheless, involved suspending civil liberties. And the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the National Police Force, moved in and forcibly ended the occupation and arrested several leaders, some of whom spent weeks in jail for mischief, counseling mischief, and intimidation. Nevertheless, the movement is stopped, but and the mandates have disappeared, but it's clear that the growth of the far right is not going anywhere. It's not going away. Protests have continued. There's been like fairly aggressive protests against Justin Trudeau since then, against another Social Democratic Party, the New Democratic Party leader, Jagmeet Singh, who's a person of color, who got physically intimidated and attacked at a rally for a provincial election campaign in Ontario. There's been a growth recently, actually, and it's been in the news a lot in Canada, of QAnon, and fairly aggressive actions of QAnon supporters in the hundreds, going to different cities and trying to target police and put them under citizens' arrest. So this growth in the far right movement is not disappearing. And my last point, just to wrap up here, as I alluded to at the very beginning, is one of the Conservative Party supporters of the convoy movement, Pierre Poilievre, someone who's been using conspiracy theories, particularly around the World Economic Forum, won in a landslide the Conservative Party election. What that means in terms of the policies he'll pursue as Conservative Party leader, whether they'll be more mainstream or more far right, people shift in these contexts, I guess we'll wait and see. But that's the sort of like the context and the background for the far right in the Canadian context. And I'll just wrap up there, and I look forward to questions and discussion.
Thanks so much, Todd. Before I introduce Jeanelle, reminder to folks that you can insert your questions for the speakers in the Q&A using that function at the bottom of your screen. I encourage you to do that because we have lots of time for discussion after the presentations. Please go ahead and take it away, Jeanelle.
Awesome. First, I'd like to start by thanking the TNI conference organizers for putting together this gathering. Of course, I'd like to thank Ashley and Nick and Bill for extending the invitation and really curating this panel and space for us to be having a conversation about something that is so politically pertinent and relevant, not just here within North America, but also in Europe. I'm reading today's news or yesterday's news on Liz Truss and kind of cackling. I think it will dovetail very nicely with my talk today. I want to first start by sort of foregrounding my talk and some of the questions that we came up with. I think my talk really is going to deal a lot with the question of how is the rise of the far right a response to neoliberalism and capitalist crises. I'm also going to grapple with the questions of what kind of organizing responses to the far right have you seen, where you're located, as well as what are some of the driving forces behind the rise of the far right. So my name is Jeanelle Hope. I'm a scholar activist. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, organized for some years in Sacramento in sort of response to police violence, as well as doing sort of Black art and cultural space advocacy. For the past 4 years, I've been in Texas, where I'm a college professor, and have worked with Black and Brown racial justice community-based groups like United Fort Worth. And for the past year, I've had the pleasure of being able to work with Bill on our forthcoming book project, The Black Antifascist Tradition. Growing up in the San Francisco Bay Area, really this sort of epicenter for 1960s social movements, I've always been surrounded by forms of radicalism, robust political thought in terms of thinking about third worldism, Black nationalism, Black power, labor movements. Oakland, Berkeley, San Francisco have been sites for that sort of groundbreaking political work. When I moved to Sacramento, I found myself in organizing spaces that were certainly multiracial, but absolutely Black-led. And it was during the sort of 2018 protests responding to the killing of Stephon Clark by Sacramento PD that I found myself in company with some great Antifa folks, many of which were comrades that I worked with in other spaces. Fast forward 2 years, we see this sort of global rebellion in response to the killings of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, George Floyd, and a host of other African-American men, women, children, and trans folks by the state. Within the discourse, there seemed like this incessant amount of vitriol being spewed, demonizing anti-fascists, both from the mainstream media, as well as Black communities and Black political pundits. In ways, I was stunned that we lived in a world where being an anti-fascist was seen as something grotesque and anti-democratic. I was stunned that Black folks within my community didn't necessarily understand that we've always had the proverbial boot of fascism on our necks, and that many Black activists across the Black liberation movement have been ardent anti-fascist, from Ida B. Wells to George Jackson and Angela Davis, to Langston Hughes, to William Patterson, and many others that we talk about in our book project. In my work, I certainly define fascism as a political ideology that shapes far-right movements. I talk about fascism and its sort of intrinsic characteristics in terms of thinking about authoritarianism, sort of charismatic cult-like dictator leaders, certainly about sort of anti-democratic policies, embracing of sort of far-right nationalism, this sort of dual application of the law that bestows privileges typically to sort of white folks versus criminalizing Blackness, certainly identifying fascism as being something that's fueled by racial capitalism, there being sort of the overwhelming sort of salience of white supremacy, and sort of genocidal violence, right? At the crux, this is how fascism works, right? These are key ingredients to the sort of the evil soup or pot, right? But beyond these features, my work and the work that Bill and I are doing together around fascism, particularly American fascism, foregrounds anti-Blackness and anti-Black state violence as an inextricably linked feature of the ideology, right? In thinking about slavery as an anti-democratic and authoritarian sort of institution, thinking about the prevalence of settler colonialism, right? Our nation's history of lynching, and naming that as genocide and state-sanctioned violence, as well as our system of law that disproportionately criminalizes and punishes Black and brown folks, right? In my works, these are the roots of American fascism. We also offer this sort of comparative analysis of Italian race laws, the Nuremberg laws, and Jim Crow laws, showing how the racial politics that led to the rise of fascism in Europe were very much based on early American laws coming out of the Reconstruction era, as a means to be able to assert this sort of social hierarchy for recently liberated Black folks coming out of slavery. In the book, we talk about the various ways Black people have engaged anti-fascism over time, right? And thinking about Ida B. Wells' anti-lynching campaign, how Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon sort of theorize and analyze fascism through the lens of colonialism, William Patterson's petition to charge the United States with genocide, right, towards the UN in 1951, and even thinking about the Black Panther Party's commitment to anti-fascist work through their intercommunal committees to combat fascism, these sort of small Black Panther Party networks that provided mutual aid work in the absence of state investment to Black and brown communities. And even the party's work in helping to reintroduce readers to the politic of anti-fascism through their newspaper. But today I wanted to share a bit from a recent chapter that I just finished, and in part be a little bit selfish so I can talk this out with you all, hear myself talk through it, but I also think it really foregrounds this sort of discussion on how the sort of rise in the far right is this response to neoliberal crises. So I'm going to do a little bit of reading and a little bit of talking through. This chapter really traces Black anti-fascism through Black anarchism, anarchists, and political prisoners. In a letter of support demanding the release of Angela Davis, James Baldwin shared, quote, "The enormous revolution in Black consciousness which has occurred in your generation, my dear sister, means the beginning or the end of America. Some of us, white and Black, know how great a price has already been paid to bring into existence a new consciousness, a new people, and an unprecedented nation," end quote. Baldwin aptly captured the work of Davis and her Black Power comrades. Black Power in all of its politics and strategies certainly reshaped the social and political landscape of the mid-1960s and into the 1970s. However, Davis was also a part of a budding contingent of activists being swept up by the state and incarcerated in some of the nation's most brutal and inhumane prisons, largely on charges stemming from their political affiliations. Political prisoners produced an entire genre of anti-fascist writings that were written to reshape and propel the movement, with the revenue of some of their sales being reinvested in Black Power organizations themselves. Their writings, both political and intellectual in substance, became a primary mode of resistance and movement building, pushing the bounds of Black consciousness even further by shaping the, quote, political priorities of those on the outside. For them, it was no question that the Black experience in the United States had been one built on fascism. That wasn't up for debate. Their works, however, gestured towards the confluence of the rising far right and neoliberalism, a kindred match that would sharpen the future of American fascism for the next 50 years. In his early writings, George Jackson defined fascism as, quote, "a police state wherein the political ascendancy is tied into and protects the interests of the upper class, characterized by militarism, racism, and concedes further that criminals and crime arise from material, economic, and socio-political causes," end quote. By 1971, with the publication of Jackson's Blood in My Eye, his analysis on fascism deepened. He understood that the next phase of fascism emerging within the US will be a response to the rapidly shifting economic and political landscape of the 1970s, and would ultimately serve as a repudiation of major civil rights advancements. Jackson began using the term fascism corporativism to describe the impact of the rise of neoliberalism and conservatism had in reshaping fascism in the immediate post-civil rights era. That same year, Lewis Powell Jr., soon to be Supreme Court Associate Justice, issued an inflammatory memorandum, as most commonly known as the Powell Memorandum. This really became sort of like the blueprint for the far right. In this memo, Powell is decrying the state of American society, particularly these youth-led movements of the 1960s, these hippies, these Black Power folks that are coming out, and really trying to advance the, quote, dignity of minority personhood, and are also sort of engaged in sort of environmentalism as well. Powell argued that these recent civil rights laws and progress made by labor unions really created this rupture for business. He called for his fellow conservatives to infiltrate and surveil colleges and universities to disrupt the sort of popularity of anti-capitalist capitalist politics and liberal pundits. He advocated for more conservative faculty to be hired to surveil and rewrite textbooks, and overall called for the government to coalesce around this sort of push for a pro-business, pro-capitalist conservative agenda, right? And really to bolster the corporate privatization and profit margins while undoing the social gains that were made just less than a generation prior. Powell's vision is very much actualized under the presidencies of Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Reagan, and later on Donald Trump. Beyond Republican administrations, Powell's memo continues to be heralded as the blueprint for conservative far-right movements, with the overturning of Roe v. Wade, the school choice movement, anti-CRT movements, all being part of Powell's greater legacy. While George Jackson did not necessarily live long enough to see the fruits of Powell's vision, Jackson's use of fascism, corporatism aptly captured the blurring and ultimately convergence of the state and corporate interests that Powell advocated for. Angela Davis echoed this assessment of the 1970s American fascism in a statement to the University of California Board of Regents, where she named the, quote, Nixons, Agnews, and Reagans as capitalist yes men who have stolen the wealth of the world from the people by exploitation and oppression. Furthermore, the convergence of the state and corporate interests were at the crux of Benito Mussolini's vision of fascism in Italy, as he notoriously proclaimed, quote, fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of the state and corporate power. Both Davis and Jackson understood that the latest stage of capitalism, neoliberalism, would have major implications across racial lines. Going into the decade, the US economy began showing signs of shock and strain, much of it brought on by a steady pivot towards neoliberalism and its hallmark agenda of deregulation, privatization, tax reductions for corporations and high earners, and a greater concern for shareholder margins and profits. These policies helped usher in high unemployment, deindustrialization, and sharp inflation throughout the decade, spilling over into the 1980s and beyond. Jackson deduced that much of the early defining and theorizing on American fascism within the Black radical tradition focused mainly on the nationalist and white supremacist characteristics of the system and not enough on understanding fascism as an economic rearrangement. Jackson was keenly aware of how race, particularly anti-Blackness, shaped American fascism. However, his theorizing on the system took more of a Black Marxist approach by specifically interrogating the economic aspects of fascism through the lens of racial capitalism. Jackson identified two major economic shifts that drew the country closer to fascism, this being the rise of neoliberalism or corporativism that he witnessed in the immediate years leading up to the 1970s. The second shift had occurred over a century earlier and can best be summed up as monopoly capitalism and the consolidation of political power. Following the Civil War, the myriad of plantations, small businesses, and factories were replaced by corporations that were propelled by the Industrial Revolution and exploitation of the working class, particularly those of color. Those same corporations will use their wealth and status to influence not only economic markets, but also social and political affairs at the federal, state, and local levels. Unequivocally, nearly every US president since Reconstruction has worked to uphold and bolster this system of monopoly capitalism. Furthermore, this major economic shift coincided with the growth of law enforcement and the modernization of criminal justice system. So I'm going to stop sort of reading a little bit, but it is through sort of these political prisoner writings that we see the Black anti-fascist tradition deepening into this interrogation of how neoliberalism, starting in sort of the 1970s, is helping bolster fascism within the United States. Later in the chapter, I start to talk about how these political prisoners more or less are alluding to that we need to up the ante in terms of how we actually fight the far right. And many have grown disillusioned with certainly the peace and nonviolence of the civil rights era, or even the let's shoot back, self-defense sort of take of the Black Power era, with many folks turning to Black anarchy. And so I talked through the work of political prisoners like Martin Sostra and Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, who were instrumental in the founding and generation of Black anarchist thought, right? Black anarchy isn't just about chaos, violence, or rejecting government rule. For Black anarchists, anarchy was about autonomy, right? Anarchy, not only from the government, but also from the incessant whiteness of typical anarchist spaces. I talk about also how Black anarchy was defined as both an ideology, but moreover as a sort of a tactic and strategy through underground groups like the Black Liberation Army, as well as a Black and brown LGBT group of the 1970s called STAR, the Street Transvestite Action Revolutionaries. And so I talk about anarchy being sort of defined or manifesting through these sort of 4 A's: autonomy, antagonism, abolition, and then talking about anarchism more broadly, right? So one of the tactics that we see Black anarchists of these sort of 1970s into 1980s engaging on the streets is the use of autonomous zones. I think many in North America following the 2020 protests might have been familiar with Chaz, or the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone that was erected in Seattle, right, where folks took to the streets, took over a major Capitol Hill area and said, this is for the people, we will not allow police here. And so I talk about how MOVE, a Black Power organization starting in sort of 1973, does something similar with this sort of Black Power communal living autonomous zone that ultimately resulted in the communal living being bombed by the city of Philadelphia in 1985, right? These were folks who identified as Black anarcho-primitivists, right? Meaning that they identified with a form of what's called like primitivism, anarchism, and that they were trying to return to like very natural states of being, rejecting technology and all these sorts of things. I also talk about the antagonism of the area, right? For many Black anarchists, it wasn't just enough to like shoot back at the far right and the nationalist movements. They were dead set on trying to weaken the state, right? And this happens through various sort of shootouts, right? Bank robberies, or which they call sort of the expropriation of state funds, plane hijackings. You see these sort of prison breaks that really sort of animate the Black anarchy politics of the 1970s and 1980s. And then finally, in this chapter, I talk a lot about abolition, right? Abolition is the most salient and visionary feature of Black anarchy. This framework and organizing tactic has its roots certainly in slavery and later in the works of political prisoner intellectuals like Jackson and Davis that I talked through a little bit earlier that would lay the foundation for the prison abolition movement. Abolition and its many tentacled genealogy also serves as a major delineation between Black anarchist thought and non-Black formations of anarchy. Drawing on Avery Gordon's work, abolition involves, quote, critique, refusal, and rejection of which you wish to abolish, end quote, all of which overlap with anarchy, illustrating how these two are linked. Abolition calls on us to imagine a world without fascism. And I want to close my talk by asking you all to consider what an anti-fascist world might look like. I look forward to continuing that discussion during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeanelle. Natasha will be next. Before I hand it over, I remind folks, if you have questions you'd like to pass on to the panelists, please, and put them in the Q&A, and Ashley and I will pass them forward after the 3 speakers have finished up. Thanks so much. Natasha, take it away.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Bill. And thank you to everyone at TNI for organizing this and bringing us together. I also want to offer a huge thanks to both Todd and Jeanelle for those really brilliant talks. And I want to also echo, before I move on to my small area of focus for today, I want to echo both the previous speakers in insisting upon the continuity of fascism with racial capitalism, the challenge against claims of the far right as a working class movement rather than a defense of property and capital, and a challenge to the idea that, these claims of freedom have anything to do with real liberation. It was a little disturbing during the Freedom Convoy to see predominantly white leftists seem to have a little too much time for the disruptions as they were playing out in Canada. And I'm sure we can talk about that a little bit later. I'm gonna both kind of double down on what's been said already and support that fully, and then draw our attention to some more aspects that I think are undergirding and driving much of the far right, which I also call fascist, assemblages, movements, and state formations in North America right now. I think it's particularly a relevant area I want to touch upon if we have some viewers in where I'm from. I live in New York, but where I'm from, evidently England, because for the last years, we've seen some really appalling anti-trans normalization across the entire political spectrum in the UK. And that is obviously echoed in the US, but is very, very, very central to the fascist movements here. Anti-trans, anti-Blackness are foundational cause to contemporary and historic fascism. So that's what I'm going to focus on here, both pronatalism and anti-trans activism, and that central role in far-right formations today. So the far-right agenda, which at this point in North America and the United States is just the agenda of the Republican mainstream and its state and vigilante enforcers. And this is a program, to be clear, of palingenic Christo-nationalism, a core fascistic myth of national rebirth with the nation recast in its original form. That is, in which the only rights protected are those of property, patriarchy, and whiteness. And those are, of course, the foundations of the United States, slave colony as it is and was. Pronatalism has been central to every major fascist assemblage in history. This is how the nation is reborn. And to borrow a term from the late scholar of the radical Black tradition, Cedric Robinson, this is how the nation is re-whitened. Of course, fascistic pronatalism has always necessarily gone hand in hand with the organized elimination of oppressed populations. For Mussolini, pronatalism was no less than an obsession, and one we can see echoed in the priorities of Italy's new extreme right prime minister, Giorgia Meloni, and her fascist party, Brothers of Italy. In the exact same vein, the US right is entrenching a program of forced births and what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment at the same time. So enforced birth and organized abandonment, which is a necropolitical order, make work and let die, the demands of sovereign capital. And in the center of this political order, we have a figuration. It's the classic figuration at the center of any right-wing political order, and that is the imagined child, invariably white, invariably cis, and always in peril. And it is it's in the name of this non-existent child that actually living children must suffer under fascism. The far right, you might notice, is really obsessed with non-existing children. And that's not new at all. There's been the long worry about the zygote or the embryo as if it were already a child, which it is not. And then there was the whole generation of non-existent children whose brains were apparently turned to fried eggs on marijuana, giving cause to arrest, criminalize, and incarcerate millions and millions of Black children, particularly young Black boys. For the far right and for conservative liberals, who have certainly aided and abetted and converged with the far right over and over again, Black so-called super predator children, thank you for that one, Hillary Clinton, have always been a powerful racist fantasy Again, non-existent children. In recent years, another type of non-existent child has really driven the right and its campaigns and ideological focus. And that non-existent child is the child who is groomed, the child somehow coerced into becoming trans. To be clear, none of the categories of children, these non-existent children I've just named, exist as actually living children, even if a number of real children are wrongly described in these terms by the right wing. But people who don't exist are far better suited to fascioid political manipulation and prurient psychological projection. Meanwhile, living, breathing, actual children with lives that should get to richly matter are sacrificed. And great harm is done again and again to existing children in the name of the figurative cis white child. The far right's decimation of women and other pregnant people's bodily autonomy cannot be considered separate from its harrowing eliminationist agenda around trans children. Pronatalism and trans eliminationism are inextricably linked in contemporary far right politics. So in the US right now, nationwide, Republican politicians are walking in absolute lockstep to promote this agenda. In Texas, the governor Greg Abbott famously issued a directive to state agencies, bending his laws to the Republican will to assert that gender-affirming healthcare constitutes child abuse, and that those who provide it or support children in accessing it should be investigated as potential abusers, from anyone from a psychologist, a doctor, parents, loving guardians. The Texas Department of Family and Protective Services, acting like cops as they do, has been duly terrorizing families with investigations of child abuse when a child is reported to be supported as gender non-conforming. Much like Texas's now notorious anti-abortion law, enforcement relies upon vigilantism and a Christian nationalist surveillance state. These things go together. Hundreds more bills are taking direct aim at the lives of trans kids and adults, and they're moving through state houses in the US with a chilling speed. And in Congress, the far-right extremist Marjorie Taylor Greene, some of you might have seen her toting massive guns, ARs, generally being a QAnon election-denying Republican congresswoman, she has now introduced the first piece of federal legislation, co-sponsored with 40 plus other House Republicans, to outlaw all gender-affirming care for minors. This law, were it to become law, would charge those who provided such care as felons, and that would be punishable with up to 25 years in prison. To be clear, this is genocidal and eliminationist, but also, to be extra clear, the ubiquity of these anti-trans assaults is no sign that there's some sort of grassroots concern truly echoing nationwide about trans children as some sort of panic. This panic is manufactured. It's top down. Think tanks like the Promise to America's Children Coalition, they disseminate model legislation to Republican state lawmakers. It is a deeply cynical electoral strategy, playing on conservative concerns, but it doesn't make it any less an ideological warfare. There's no inconsistency in the far right championing parental choice on most every issue aside from a parent's choice to love and support a gender non-conforming child. Parental choice was only about parenting as an institution, the nuclear family, for reproducing the right's Christo-nationalist order. When a parent's choice is that schools should whitewash the brutal realities of US white supremacist history or deny the existence of gay people, then a parent's choice gets to be sacred. To produce the wrong kind of child, meanwhile, is deemed criminal, alongside the refusal to produce a child from a pregnancy. So for those who would like to defend women's reproductive freedoms, but do not support trans rights, the US far right offers consistent reminders that these issues cannot and must not be disentangled. The history of white supremacist colonialism is also a history of enforced gender binaries. It's no accident and certainly no surprise that today's deeply reactionary reproductive politics have come hand in hand with anti-trans attacks. We need to reject and counter the outright falsehoods of Republican anti-trans claims, and we need to actively support trans kids. Trans children are not new, and more than 2 centuries of scientific research have challenged the validity of both gender and sex binaries. Efforts to legislate and attack trans children out of existence should not be seen as some discrete outgrowth of a distracting culture war, as all too many liberals and alleged leftists would have it. Anyone who claims to care about the right-wing state's monopoly on violence, healthcare austerity, austerity and determinations over which lives get to matter should be fighting for trans children and adults now. Treating trans lives as a trend or a distraction from anti-capitalist, anti-fascist struggle plays into the hands of the reactionary right, which is at base seeking to expand the state's authoritarian control over life while withdrawing provisions for living, like healthcare and housing. That is, again, make work, let die, in the name of an imaginary child. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha. Thank you, all 3 speakers. Fantastic, bracing, really invigorating talks. I have a couple things quickly. Rose J has asked in the chat if the recording of the session will be available. It will be available after this session. If you registered for the event, you'll receive the recording. It will also be posted to the Transnational Institute website, so please watch it again and share with friends. I want to remind folks, we have about half an hour for discussion, and I want to encourage people to drop their questions in the Q&A, which is the easiest way for us to send them forward. So I'm going to start with the 2 questions that are sitting in there now. I'm just going to toss these out for everyone, and you can each take a spin at it if you'd like. The first question comes from John B. Trump clearly enabled and emboldened fascists. Do you consider him a fascist? Also, given his possible return to power and the continued ascendancy of the far right within the Republican Party, what can the left do in the next 2 years to expose and undermine their power economically, politically, and culturally? And related to Jeanelle's talk, what would some of the leading Black anarchist thinkers say? A really easy one. Is Trump a fascist? But would any of you like to take a go at it?
I'll go ahead. I'll say quick answer. Yes, Trump is absolutely a fascist. Leans into certainly all of some of the major characteristics of fascism. It certainly has this sort of cult-like dictator appeal that has certainly worked in terms of galvanizing and uniting the far right within this country, while also completely splintering his party or dragging it down. With regards to what would some of the leading what would some of the leading Black anarchist thinkers say? These are conversations that are absolutely having. I would point whomever asked this question, or John B., to Lorenzo Comboa Irvin's podcast, the Black Autonomy podcast. Lorenzo Comboa Irvin was one of the Black anarchists that I mentioned a little bit earlier, and absolutely situating Trump within this sort of historical period of 1970 to the present that I cover as being a product of this sort of rise of the far right that happens in the 70s, right? I think Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, as well as Black anarchists, would say that we should be out in the streets, certainly. We should absolutely go beyond just, advocating that folks vote and utilize a sort of democratic apparatus that still remain in place, and recognize that many of those apparati, including like the courts, are no longer there to push this sort of liberal agenda, right, that we once able word, right? Where we see this sort of progress. And so what does, mutual aid work look like? What does the Lorenzo Combo of Irvin and Black Anarchists would certainly say, what does sort of a general strike look like? That's something that we have really yet to see within recent years within the United States. I think it's something we certainly should be borrowing from folks who've been organizing in Europe. What does sort of armed revolt look like, especially in thinking about the rise of state sanctioned as well as far right sort of violence that we're seeing. I really appreciated Natasha's talk and foregrounding discussions on what's happening in our schools, right? Those are battles also that have to be waged, right? So we constantly need to be in resistance to what's happening, right? And utilizing various tactics.
Thanks, Jeanelle.
Yeah, I just first of all just totally agree, but also just in terms of the good old canard of like, is Trump a fascist? Like the fascism debate, which has obviously now been going on, as soon as Trump came to any sort of potentially presidential prominence. And it's always sort of struck me why people are so obsessed with the potential of like overusing the word fascism, which, or that, it's not fascism unless it comes from like the fascist region of Italy. Whereas, so many concepts that we use work as family resemblance concepts, to borrow a term from the philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, that the writer Umberto Eco also used to talk about fascism. And that is, it's not that there's just a list of complete and coherent things that if something is a fascist person or a fascist group or a fascist assemblage will always have every single one of those features. Rather, there are these sort of open Venn diagrams of interlocking features, which when an assemblage or a character or a figure or a person engages with enough of them, of course, it makes sense to describe that as fascist. And Jeanelle rightly named what so many of those things are, anti-Blackness, nationalist racism, military vigilantism, charismatic or authoritarian leader. Things can be fascistic if they don't have all of those aspects, but when you have enough of them, what is the resistance to calling something fascist? And indeed, what I find useful about calling something like Trumpism a type of fascism is that it calls upon an anti-fascist response. To call something fascist is to engage in the sort of speech act to say, well, surely if that's fascist, we must be anti-fascist in response. And that is a very specific type of resistance that's not liberal go vote resistance. It's the kind of resistance that Jeanelle was just talking about. So that's why I think it's not just possible to call Trump a fascist. I think it's important.
Thank you. Todd, do you want to take a swing at it from the Canadian perspective? You mentioned Trump's influence on Canada in passing, or to talk about how the Freedom Convoy might be.
Can people hear me? I just lost Bill.
I can hear you. I think Bill briefly froze, but I think I can hear you.
Phenomenon.
Yeah. Sorry, Bill. I missed a good chunk of your question because you froze. I
was asking if you'd like to take a swing at the Trump question from Canada.
Yeah, so it's obvious, as I pointed out, I think Trump is influential in Canada with far right, or at least provided like encouragement and incentivized people to, including fascists, to take to the streets and try to build themselves. Yeah, I'm on the other side of this question. I don't think Trump is a fascist. I think Trump clearly is, like, there's obviously fascists and lots of them in the United States, and many of whom were Trump supporters. I think some of them probably aren't Trump supporters. They don't think he was sufficiently far right enough. But for me, I'm the kind of person who lands on the side of like the inverse of what Natasha was saying, Well, I actually do think that, well, I understand the concept is needs to be stretched a little bit, and there's a fluidity to it, and that it's not going to absolutely look like it did in the 1930s during the so-called, maybe called the classical period. I do think there's certain kinds of like core features to me that are important to discerning what's fascist and what's not. And I don't think personally that Trump actually, while he's adjacent to fascist, I would consider Trump, I use the term far right as something that's slightly broader, that's to the right of mainstream conservatism, and that would include fascists within it. And there's gray areas between the fascists and the non-fascists in the far right. They can bleed into one another, and I think there's certainly a tendency in certain political periods for those non-fascist far right folks to get drawn even further towards fascism. But I don't think you necessarily need to be a fascist to be in the far right. A far right to me more generally is someone who's much more extreme and committed to their utterly reactionary politics, the transphobic, the racist, and so on, things that other folks have mentioned, and probably has a greater disposition towards violence. And I think a fascist is someone for whom the violence is far more central to their politics, and central to it is the building of a street-based movement as a way of enforcing power and how they conceive of order, and goes beyond the sort of normal machinations of government and law. And obviously Trump stretched that, so like I'm acknowledging there's a real gray area there. But to me, I think if you look at core features of both classical period fascists and fascists that have emerged and have gained power post the core period, in various periods in which fascists grow, tends to be during periods of severe crisis. I wouldn't count Trump amongst them. I mean, the fact that he managed, people can point out all the electoral problems in the United States and they exist elsewhere, but like there wasn't like fascists in power are supported in power because normal kind of constitutional means are not successful for enforcing an agenda. And you see suspension of those constitutional means, civil liberties, and the explicit and concerted and consistent use of violence in a way that's even beyond what the American state does now, in my opinion. And so I think, to me, like I like the idea that capitalism is a social order whose disposition and gravitational pull is away from democracy and widespread popular political participation, even in the kind of liberal sense of that, and has a clear authoritarian disposition to it. And that authoritarian character can come in any number of means, including classical liberals who are, to my mind, from John Locke to John Stuart Mill to Jeremy Bentham, had authoritarian, pro-colonial, racist, anti-worker policies to them, and were advocates of violence and authoritarianism and anti-democratic. Right, to the order liberals of Germany of the 1920s, most of whom weren't fascists and didn't become fascists, but were clearly antithetical to and had a great antipathy towards democracy and a premise like and centered order and unaccountable state and bourgeois structures. Fascism is part of that continuum. And so Trump to me is a gray area in that, but I wouldn't call him fascist. Even though he supported fascists and he might like give space to fascists or did give space to fascists, clearly he did, sorry. But that doesn't, to me, make him fascist.
Thank you, Todd. I'm gonna piggyback a question, which you sort of, I was gonna ask you about liberalism's role in fascism, but I think you've touched on it. But I wanted to, each of you mentioned neoliberalism in one way or the other in your talks as part of the historical trajectory of the moment that we're in. And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about how you do or don't see the rise of the far right as a kind of neoliberal outcome or an outcome of neoliberalism per se. I'm also interested in maybe a related question. Neoliberalism also came along with a pretty significant rejection of identity-based political movements for liberation, right? It seems to me there's a correspondence between neoliberalism's trajectory and this intense reaction to identitarianism in the moment that we're living. So I was wondering if any of you could talk about that in any way, shape, or form.
I'll take a stab at it. So I talked a little bit about neoliberalism's rise in the US in the 1970s through the Powell Memorandum, which, as you're saying, Bill, is straight up this rejection of sort of identity-based politics, this rejection of all these 1960s youth-led movements that are striving for racial justice, civil rights, all of these sort of social issues of folks who are on the margins, right? Powell's memorandum is pushing for this embrace of business as personhood, right? That he talks about business as a person that needs to be protected. I think what we're seeing in this moment really is sort of a chickens coming home to roost, right? Neoliberalism emerges out of this very sort of arguably far right and conservative space, but at the same time, in an economic moment where we're seeing high inflation, where we're seeing shortages, just rampant discussion on will people be able to afford, heating costs, where we're talking about wage stagnation. These are the outcomes of multiple generations of a neoliberal agenda that has been pushed by conservatives and folks on the far right. However, those folks who are a part of the far right movement, sort of, at the grassroots, working class folks, are also being harmed and scathed by it, and are pointing to, perhaps folks who have more racialized identities as being the problem for why they are experiencing said class sort of marginalization, and not aptly pointing to the conservative politics and far right politics that have fueled the push and thrust of neoliberalism for the last 50 years, right? So I think what we're seeing is certainly a moment of chickens coming home to roost. I think the next year is going to be very interesting as we are imminently facing a global recession, a housing market crash, runaway, what they call it, inflation and stagnation, wage stagnation, just the ridiculousness that's happening with the Tories in the UK and their inability to push forth essentially a rebuffed version of Thatcherism. We're seeing all this come together, right? Neoliberalism over the past generations has created this society that we are currently in, and the far right is scathed by it and are responding to it, but are certainly engaging in more racial violence than class-based sort of struggle.
Thank you, Jeanelle. Natasha?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I agree. And I would also say that what I think shouldn't be left out in some of these conversations about, the rise and form of the far right now is that, there's the continuity of racial capitalism in its neoliberal form feeding into far right authoritarian assemblages, absolutely. But there's also an element of left-wing Black liberation organizing that was also in response to the state of, inequality and organized police violence and protection of property that neoliberalism demands, that in turn we have a white backlash against. So it shouldn't be forgotten that 2020 we saw the most robust and potent Black liberation uprising, certainly of my lifetime. And thank you, Jeanelle, for bringing up Chaz, because that was such an interesting moment in those uprisings, too, seeing Black liberation and anti-fascism again put in conversation, as had been very explicitly called for by, the Black Power movement. Anti-fascism was a hinge, and it wasn't waiting for things to look like Mussolini and Hitler. The police state, the prison state, the carceral system was called fascism, and I think rightly so. But again, we can debate how we're using these terms correctly or not. But in terms of what we're seeing now, I do definitely think it's appropriate to use Robinson's term, the re-whitening of America, as was first applied to describe, white backlash during Reconstruction. And I think we're seeing that again. I think we also saw that in the 70s. So it's the kind of line that is very much in response to neoliberalism, but it is also in response to Black organizing, tenants' power, unions forming, workers organizing in ways that we haven't seen for generations. And we're seeing a really LGBTQ plus trans people supporting each other and being able to live. We're seeing massive backlash to that I think is driving a huge amount. And those, that's one of those like history bring fractal moments. It's a re-whitening.
Thank you, Natasha. Todd? No?
On that point about the re-whitening, I mentioned that one of the flags that gets flown by the far right and fascists in the Canadian context is the red ensign flag. And people probably aren't aware of what the red ensign flag is, but it's basically the flag that existed that was the Canadian flag before the maple leaf. Kind of looks like a British flag. There's a Union Jack in there. And but the maple leaf gets adopted at the time that immigration policy is changing in Canada from an explicit kind of whites only policy in the mid-60s to another kind of immigration policy called the point system, which is supposed to be more multicultural. Although actually, interestingly, just as an aside, far right groups in France, I'm told, and I know Trump actually have talked up the virtues of Canada's point system because it kind of just reproduces certain kinds of patterns. But in any case, the red ensign flag is being flown because it's like a flag before multiculturalism and before changes to immigration policy. And so one of the symbols is, they're not like always saying it exactly, but it's like playing on that theme of like, this is what Canada that we want, the Canada great again, the kind of thing, which is the pre-changing Canadian demographics. And so that's just sort of that kind of re-whitening. But in terms of the question around neoliberalism that you posed, Bill, I think new liberalism, and just to go back to the point that you were making that I sort of gestured at earlier, which is that like the liberal tradition, which is being sort of recast with neoliberalism after the interregnum of the post-war settlement in the welfare state. Liberalism is an authoritarian political tradition. We should be very clear about that. Whatever it says about like individual rights and so on, those are never meant to be extended to the broad base of the population, to women, to working class people, to the colonized, to the racialized groups. If people have won those rights, it's because they fought for them. So the liberal tradition, I don't think we can stress this enough. It has a real authoritarian character to it, and that is a thread that runs through the history of capitalism. And so with the like one part, like the growth of neoliberalism from the 70s onwards is obviously connected in other like Jeanelle and Natasha have made this point, so I don't need to reiterate it, but it's rooted in violence. It's rooted very heavily in violence. And I think that a system born of that kind of violence creates the space, and it becomes a sort of normalized feature of it, the kind of racist, colonial, anti-worker aspects to it, where certain bodies and certain peoples are much easier to be discarded. And I think that provides a space, an opening, or a foundation in which a far right, under certain conditions, can grow, and it makes it easier for them to grow. So the far right is picking up on an aspect of liberal capitalist societies that are definitionally part of those societies. It's a more extreme version of that, to my mind, that plays up or grows in certain kinds of moments. And so in the particularly like a neoliberal moment, I think that like a couple features that are just, I'll quickly mention here that I think are really important that probably deserve like more attention. But one is neoliberalism, apart from its domestic agenda, is also an agenda of global capitalism, of freeing up the ability of big multinational capital to sort of be so-called like footloose and fancy free and to move. And I think that if you're not big capital, if you're the petty bourgeois, some might succeed in that context, but a lot don't. And I think that plays a role in a rekindling sense of nation and the importance of nation and the critique of so-called globalism, often comes in conspiracy theory forms, right? But I think the roots, part of the roots of that, obviously it's very racist and anti-Semitic, but part of the roots of that are also is the ways in which neoliberalism has been deeply connected to the transnationalization or the multinationalization of capital, which benefits multinational, big, rich capital much more than it does the petty bourgeoisie, sections of which are being heavily, heavily squeezed. And then that squeezing intensifies after 2008, particularly if you're not in Canada, but 2014 and onwards in the Canadian context. And I think it's going to get even worse in the Canadian context because we're due for a very big capitalist crisis. But the other thing I'll just mention very quickly, connected to all this also, is the climate crisis. And in the Canadian context, and my sense is this is true elsewhere, but definitely in the Canadian context, the far right and fascists are very pro oil and gas, and they are like apoplectic at people who are challenging, even when they're not really, like Trudeau, but like social movements, indigenous-led movements, and so on, who are challenging fossil fuel extraction in the Canadian context. And so some of the people, when they're arrested for as leaders of the Freedom Convoy, they have links to the oil and gas industry, not as like the big oil majors, big pipeline owners, but like smaller companies that serviced it, independent truck drivers, perhaps. And one of the women who was the main organizer got arrested. She was wearing an "I love oil and gas" t-shirt. And a lot of these people, as I mentioned in my talk, were connected to the United We Roll campaign, which is connected to oil and gas. I think that's going to be a major, major fracture that the far right is going to play on in the years to come, particularly if the climate justice movement gets back to where it was before COVID, because in Canada it was growing before COVID, and COVID has really kind of affected it.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all. Okay, I'm going to try to merge two questions that have come in, one from an anonymous attendee and a second one. What are the most effective anti-fascist movements globally, in your opinion, and what can we learn from them? And a second question is, you all three happen to be located on university campuses. Someone has asked, how do we talk about, and how does the far right play out on university campuses, and what should one be doing on a university campus in response? Maybe someone's thinking here about like the attacks on like critical race theory, which basically means you just can't talk about race anymore. And this is a K through 16 phenomenon, at least in the United States. This is about public schooling as well. But I think can you speak to either of those questions about responding and organizing models, effective models, and what where they happen to be working?
I kind of take a stab at the latter question about sort of how far right movements are influencing sort of campus politics. I teach at Prairie View A&M University, historically Black college and university, or HBCU, which is actually part of the Texas A&M system. Because I'm at an HBCU and not at the flagship school, Texas A&M, I'm in an African American Studies program that certainly probably wouldn't have existed if it was pushed forward. If it was introduced in the current anti sort of critical race theory moment. There is legislation that's been passed and being passed at the state level that would not have allowed for a space like I'm in to exist. We certainly are being surveilled by the state. I mean, we have to upload our syllabi. There are reports that have to be submitted. I mean, even when applying for grants, thinking about the type of language that you are using, there are calls to sort of get rid of tenure because of some of the pushback that the legislature has received from faculty at the UT system and throughout the Texas A&M system. There's a push to institutionalize sort of both conservative and far right scholarship through UT's Liberty Center that folks might be familiar with. So absolutely, we're seeing this on college campuses. And then obviously sort of the bringing of the Shapiros, the sort of QAnon adjacent far right conspiracy theorists, quackery to campus for for events that can cause these sort of spectacles, and really sort of essentially setting students up to get into these discussions on whether or not, the liberal college students and faculty are allowing the far right and conservatives to engage in free speech, right? We're absolutely seeing this. I think what's important in this moment is to utilize the university in terms of our access to students to teach them about fascism, right? Many of my students are not familiar with how Black folks have engaged in anti-fascist organizing. So it's important for me when I teach a Black political thought class to foreground anti-fascism as a politic. I think students need to understand the entire sort of political landscape that we are in as one that is, whether or not we want to name it as openly fascistic or increasingly leaning towards fascism. I think it's important that they are able to understand that and read between the lines, and increasingly also just provide them with basic education in terms of a more diverse education. Have students who are now being restricted with regards to what they can read in high school. Kids aren't reading Kindred. Students are steered away from, literature on civil rights movement, on slave narratives, the sort of things that we at least saw a little bit of in K-12 curricula. That is being actively removed. And so part of sort of the anti-fascist work that we have to do as educators is to amplify that history, to make sure it's within our syllabi. And even though we are staring down repression from the legislature and from administrators, it's important to find ways to weave that into our work within the classroom.
Thank you, Jeanelle. Todd or Natasha?
Yeah, I'm to the latter question first, and maybe I can talk about some interesting, I think, anti-fascist constellations in the world after that. But quickly, yeah, I teach at the New School in New York City, so we don't have a big actual like far right problem in terms of, they don't invite far right speakers to join that. We don't like have a Republican club, but what I find interesting is that, like, as far as you could talk about like a left-wing university, this is still like a wildly expensive school that has been neoliberalized, like relies on adjunct labor like mine. Adjunct faculty is organizing right now to try and have some basic like fair pay and respect. And when that all falls apart, when you have the fully neoliberalized university, this is where it becomes harder and harder to actually protect and continue with anti-fascist thought and anti-capitalist thought. So, even the most like typically left-wing university, one of in the United States, is an incredibly conservative institution. So the university is, regardless of what the far right says, all universities have become, in essence, conservative institutions because they become massive property owners. NYU owns almost as much property as the Catholic Church in New York City. Columbia is displacing half of, if not more, of Harlem. So, these are the kind of, aside from just content and far right content, even if that's not particularly present in a given university in a very like blue city, the different types of authoritarian moves as university, as institution and property owner and gentrifier and insecure employer, those have to be fought against too. And I consider that part of an anti-fascist politic because, it intervenes with anti-fascist convergences, even when they're not so obvious. In terms of interesting anti-fascist movements globally, so I think a little bit like a lot of things that would never call themselves fascist, but make sense, at least in my view, and my kind of somewhat capacious use of the term, makes sense to call fascist. There are a lot of interesting movements that might not describe themselves as anti-fascist, but I think are anti-fascist. So the autonomous zone region in Syria, Rojava, feminist run, obviously imperfect, feminist organized autonomous region, I think organizes around very specifically anti-fascist politics. I would say the ongoing uprisings in Iran, feminist-led uprisings in Iran, have anti-fascist qualities, absolutely, even if they're not defining themselves as an anti-fascist uprising. So those are just two places I would point to. Obviously, yeah, it's not easy to be an organized anti-fascist in the US when you have both the far right and centrists calling you as much an enemy as, far right extremists. So yeah, tricky.
Thank you, Natasha. Todd, do you want to add anything?
Well, I think in terms of like effectiveness of movements, because for me, fascism and much of the far right is trying to build a street-based politics and to advance their politics through force. I think like building street-based militant mass movements is absolutely central to building anti-fascist politics. There has to be a balance struck there, I think, to some degree, because I've been part of anti-fascist movements that I didn't think made really much effort to try to build out widely. And at the time, this is 2016 to 2018, given the far right and fascists weren't that big on the Canadian side, even though they're trying to grow, like that wasn't a problem so much for us. So there's the street-based kind of conference shutdown. Fascists don't give them the sense that they can take public space and constantly trying to challenge them on public space, whatever that public space might be, downtown streets, campus, and so on. But when that became a problem when the convoy grew, because then suddenly there was a solidarity rally in Toronto of convoy supporters that had 5,000 to 10,000 people, like gigantic, and we had zero capacity, like no capacity at all to challenge that. And so that is, I think those are two things you need to be thinking about. And in the case of the convoy in Ottawa, while the police did very little, and I'm not encouraging police action because I'm an abolitionist, but like I'm just making the point that the police didn't do anything when the convoy was organizing. It was actually the most interesting stuff to challenge the convoy was actually protesters who took over and blockaded people trying to enter the convoy, because it would get smaller on the weekdays and get bigger on the weekends, and so that on the weekend, on a Saturday, they blockaded a bridge called Billings Bridge and kept people from actually going into the downtown core where the convoy was located. Held them there, and eventually there's like thousands of protesters, maybe several hundred protesters, and then only let these supporters of the convoy leave after they turned around, and then they took all their oil and gas and flags and so on. And to me, that's way more effective. Or another good example in the recent, like during the convoy movement, was the solidarity rallies in Vancouver, where they tried to shut down a bridge in Vancouver, and it was actually mass protesters who like shut down the convoy there. Or the convoy supporters. And so that to me is the you can win in elections and so on, but being in the streets is actually and building a movement that is both mass, dynamic, and has the confidence to challenge people, to me is the most important thing. And I think just quickly connected to that, I think on the left is the necessity of the left, weakened over 4 decades of neoliberalism, of rebuilding itself and its confidence to offer meaningful, substantive, transformative alternatives to how the world works that can draw more people in on our side who are committed to the possibility of hopeful change, and thus drawn also to an anti-fascist politics, recognizing the danger there. And the last thing I'll just mention is on my campus, there was an effort by the Proud Boys to organize in 2017 during that window I mentioned. And they were quite disruptive and threatened a number of people. But we organized my campus isn't very big, but we organized a fairly significant protest to challenge them, basically kind of shut them down. And then more recently, there's actually a faculty member on my campus, and Ontario campuses aren't that conservative. There's like strong unionization on them and so on. But there was a faculty member who's a member of the People's Party and ran for the People's Party 2 elections ago. So that's the sort of presence, but mostly he's seen as an outlier and a bit of a joke. But yeah.
Well, brilliant. We're at time, but let me take a moment to recognize again these great talks with real and virtual clapping, applauding. Really fantastic. And thank you for ending up around the need to organize. I just want to say, if you want to follow up, a couple things. If you registered for today's conference, the link to the recording will be sent to you, and then it'll be up on the Transnational Institute's YouTube channel like very, very soon. So if you go to Transnational Institute, you can watch this and share it again. Please do check out Todd's work with Midnight Sun and Jeanelle's work in Essence and Natasha's work at The Intercept to stay tuned to what they're doing and thinking about regarding the far right. In terms of organizing, I dropped a link to the Campus Anti-Fascist Network. There's a whole bunch of resources at that site about how you might think about organizing on your campus, especially if the far right comes to your campus and you want to like try to scare them away. Thanks everybody. Thanks Ashley, the TNI, Verso, Rosa Luxemburg, Steve Tung, and especially our speakers. This was really great. I hope we can all do it again and meet under even better political circumstances. So thanks everybody for coming out today.
Thank you.